Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us for the second quarter recordings of High Marks, Dr. Robin Goldstein's State Weed Rankings. My name is Riana Durrett, and I'm the Executive Director of the UNLV Cannabis Policy Institute and one of your co-hosts today. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Cannabis Policy Institute was first launched in August 2023 with the vision to expand, promote, and coordinate cannabis research, policy, and education at UNLV and beyond. One of the many ways we bring this vision to life is through regular panel discussions and webinars that spark conversation and connect the cannabis research and policy communities. For more information about our activities, including our policy briefs, newsletters, annual policy symposium, and more, please visit our website. As usual, today's High Marks episode is based around Dr. Robin Goldstein's state cannabis rankings. In a moment, he'll explain how he derives these rankings, but first I wanted to introduce our esteemed guest, known widely among cannabis law and policy circles. We are honored to welcome cannabis attorney Shawn Hauser. Shawn is a policy and regulatory expert, cannabis attorney, and partner at Vicente LLP. She co-chairs Vicente's Hemp and Cannabinoids Department, Federal and International Law Group, and runs the Vicente Texas Practice. Thank you so much for joining us, Shawn. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share your insights. I know I have many questions that I feel very privileged to be able to ask you today. One more thing before I hand it over to Dr. Goldstein. He's the director of the Cannabis Economics Group at UC Davis, where he also studies the cannabis, food, wine, and beer industries. He looks at consumer behavior, retail price trends, regulations, testing costs, legal versus illegal markets, and the economic impacts of policy. He has an AB in neuroscience and philosophy from Harvard, a JD from Yale Law School, and a PhD in economics from the University of Bordeaux. Dr. Goldstein, I'm going to pass it over to you to introduce your rankings and then and kind of the format of the show.
Thank you very much, Rihanna. And thank you so much to Shawn Hauser for being here. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to have you as my guest today. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation and going through the rankings and learning and absorbing as much as I possibly can from your insights. You've got your finger on the pulse of the cannabis industry in so many different places and ways around the country. And so I'm excited about this conversation.
No, thank you so much for having me and for all the great work you're doing. This is a perfect time for this discussion.
Absolutely. Agreed. Before I introduce the rankings, I just want to tell everyone what you have to look forward to. After I go through the rankings, we're going to discuss and debate the top 25 and some of the movements in there. And then after that, we're going to be lucky enough to get some of Shawn's insights and sort of stories about what's happening federally. Obviously, a time of very big regulatory change, as usual, but maybe even more than usual for the cannabis industry and markets. And so we're going to have a discussion about that and then learn a little bit more about Shawn's background and history and experience in the industry. So in terms of the rankings, so this is the fourth or fifth time we've done it, I guess, Rihanna. Is this number 4?
I think 4.
I think this is number 4. So it started early last year, basically with a report I did for the UNLV Cannabis Policy Institute about interstate commerce, the future of interstate cannabis commerce, and what the markets would look like and what the cannabis landscape would look like in a future world where there's legal interstate commerce. Legal interstate commerce could take a few different forms. It could happen with or without full, let's say, federal legalization and regulation. But the idea of the cannabis rankings, which basically hatched along with that project, was not to sort of evaluate at this exact moment in time who's doing best and who's making, what state's making most money, or what state's got the best working cannabis industry, or policy, but rather what states through a combination of good policy, entrepreneurship, forward-looking, thinking, and positioning in terms of economic factors like economic advantages that some states have over others, which states are best positioned now and in the future to be cannabis powerhouses. And the way that I look at it is not, obviously big states have a big advantage if you just measure them by how much money or how many businesses there are in a state. And so this is kind of a per capita analysis. It's given a state size, how, relatively speaking, how well are they doing, and how good of an opportunity is it to, let's say, invest in cannabis in that state. If I had a certain amount of money to invest in the cannabis industry right now, I don't invest in cannabis. I'm just an observer. I'm impartial, try to be as impartial as possible. So I don't have any bets, any financial bets in this game. But if I were going to place money in one place or another, if I were going to invest, where would I want to do it and why? And so that's part of what motivates the idea of these rankings. And I guess maybe a ulterior motive is, if there's policy, I know there's always some policymakers and people watching who have some influence over these policies. I'm hoping to communicate what policies are helpful and which ones are working better and worse in terms of outcomes in the states. Looking at states that are, this is all one big experiment. It's a new industry that's being created essentially out of nothing. The entire industry was illegal 30 years ago. There was no such thing as recreational cannabis anywhere in America and practically nowhere in the world. And so we're all learning by trial and error. Regulators, almost all regulators I've met and encountered around the country, share a good faith desire to make the system work, to move cannabis from the illegal system into the legal system, to create a taxed and regulated system that people can trust, that guards consumer safety, that protects public health, that gets crime off the streets and protects kids and enforces rules the way that voters intended when they voted to legalize or when legislatures decide to legalize. There's a lot of shared objectives that don't actually differ that much. And what differs a lot is the different ways different states have tried to do it. And so then this natural experiment where you see lots of different policies at the same time being unrolled in different states is really interesting as an economist to observe, or as a policy observer. And so that's the other kind of motivation behind these rankings. So without further ado, I'll just move right into them. We have the top 25. And so it's done in the format of a kind of college football poll, if you will. So we're going to start with the numbers 20 to 20 or 21 to 25. This is this quarter two. So this is the second quarter for 2026. The last edition was in early spring 2026. So this is the second edition for 2026. And the numbers in red or green indicate the movements of each of the states in these rankings since the last edition of the rankings about 3 months ago. New to the top 25, I'll start there with number 25 is Alabama. And Alabama has been like right on the edge of the bubble, around 25, 26, 27 when I do these analyses. After spending several quarters in the bubble, it's finally made the top 25. Alabama has a bunch of interesting advantages. It doesn't have a legal recreational system. It has medical since 2021. But there's a very fast-growing hemp economy, as you see all across the Southeast, which has sort of become the hemp heartland, let's say, very much in flux in many states. But Alabama, not having a recreational system, kind of leapfrogged, as some other states around there did, and created this legal hemp environment that incentivized a lot of entrepreneurship. There's a lot of gray area legally there still, as there is in other states around there. But there's structural advantages in Alabama, low costs, big agricultural tradition there. There's a huge farming tradition, lots of very experienced and expert farmers in terms of growing. It's a hot region. It's hot and humid, and it's not necessarily the perfect environment for growing outdoor. But in terms of low labor, electricity, and what other costs, there's benefits there on the farming side, the growing side, and manufacturing. It's also a relatively inexpensive state to scale up in manufacturing. So there's regulatory uncertainty persisting, as in many other states. Future restrictions could turn it back down quickly, as could happen in Florida and other places in the Southeast. But the opportunities are big there, and so it makes it into the top 25 for the first time, replacing Illinois. So Illinois is the state that fell out of the top 25 this quarter, and that's a direct result of a new, more restrictive environment for hemp. Governor Pritzker just this month in June signed some new legislation that in Illinois that basically made a U-turn. Illinois has very high prices. Since they rolled out recreational, they've had the highest prices, just about the highest prices in the country retail for, $55, $60 eighths for flower at retail. And so, and that's a combination of high taxes, high costs of doing business, high license, every kind of cost that gets introduced. Recreational cannabis systems, Illinois kind of went to the extreme on it and has very expensive but legal weed. But at the same time, Illinois was relatively permissive for a while on the hemp side, and was kind of allowing the hemp and cannabis systems to coexist. And then that, this month and this quarter has been kind of come to a halt with this new legislation, and so that's why Illinois falls out. Other notable movers in this 21 through 25, Georgia loses a couple spots. They've been going, as with Texas, they've been going back and forth, toying, playing, fighting over legislation that looks like it's going to shut down a big part of the hemp industry there. Hasn't been completely codified yet, but it's looking scary, I think, for hemp operators in Georgia, and that's why they lose a couple spots. New York was out of the top 25 at one point. It was around 25. It's slowly climbing back up. New York City is the largest single cannabis market in the urban cannabis market for consumers in the country. Obviously, New York, huge state with a lot of consumer demand, tourism, huge opportunities, about as big opportunities you can see anywhere. And yet they've done almost everything you can imagine to screw up the legal cannabis system since the very beginning, ranging from just an almost impossible bureaucracy to work your way through in order to get open, as well as like a bungled social equity program that kind of caused more problems than it solved. And finally, there's been a lot of discussion in New York. It's under the microscope. It's of international interest as a market and so forth. So I think there's been, a lot of discussion and talk, and smart people thinking, how can we fix this, and recognizing the problems and trying to tackle them. And slowly you've got more retailers than ever before, by far, open in New York. Finally, prices finally starting to come down a little bit, maybe slowly starting to look at some light at the end of the tunnel. So that's my spiel about 21 through 25. I want to turn it over to Shawn now, and then to Riana to give me your hot takes, comment, agree, disagree, any reactions there.
No, I think that those are pretty right on rankings. And it's interesting, states like Illinois that have had kind of the parallel hemp and marijuana channels, some of them are, going in one direction or the other. And Alabama, is finally moving towards getting operational on its medical program, which has taken some years. Texas is having a similar experience, but I think legal sales just launched wasn't it in May? And sort of like Texas, there's non-smokable forms, but they have this hemp program and in parallel that's really an adult use, kind of regulate like alcohol hemp program. I'm curious about Georgia. I wonder if it ends up moving up, because Georgia's, I think, uniquely suited for rescheduling in some ways, and also is another state that has a parallel hemp market that contributes to its, kind of growing, a little bit progressive cannabis market in some capacities, but it has a pretty strong hemp program. And on the cannabis side, it was the state that originally tried to license pharmacies to sell cannabis, which may now have actually a legal path forward in Schedule III. So they may be sort of uniquely suited for the the new era of medical cannabis, where we have some more stringent, medical regulations, and we integrate into the healthcare system. So even though that framework, maybe wasn't effective early on, it may, bear fruit with Schedule III. But it'll be interesting to see, what this means for its adult use trajectory, depending on what it does with its hemp program in, the event the November redefinition takes effect. Georgia's one of the states, I think, that's likely waiting on the federal government to give more guidance on the hemp ban, or to, get closer to November. I don't think it's likely they would proceed with a hemp program in violation of federal law. But certainly anything's possible these days.
That's very interesting. So actually, just to jump ahead a little bit, I'd love for you to say a few more words right now. I don't want to wait till later, because this is going to frame the discussion of some of those later in the top 25. So Schedule III impacts medical cannabis programs in an interesting way, as you've just mentioned. So what does it do? A state like Georgia that has medical and not recreational, how does that position them exactly in terms of their ability to maybe kind of leapfrog a recreational system, or or create a working medical system that's uniquely positioned to succeed in a way that it wouldn't have been before rescheduling?
Yeah, I mean, I think just, I guess with respect to your first question, the April 2026 order, formally reclassified medical cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. So medical cannabis businesses in Georgia, are now federally legal, and the new framework for medical cannabis is one, contingent on compliance with state licensure, and two, subject DEA regulations, which are a little bit more medical in nature when you look at kind of the dispensing forms and quotas.
Right.
So, there ends up being a pathway for pharmacies to handle cannabis as long as, one, it was authorized by state law. Every compliance hinges totally on state law. And two, whether, it's within the rules of the Board of Pharmacy and otherwise compliant with the DEA regulations. But I think, we may see, more sincere medical programs and the growth of a adult use framework, as we move towards this June 29th hearing and consider the rescheduling of adult use cannabis. I think the future looks like what is medical cannabis, where you can maybe make drug claims based on research supporting safety and efficacy. Perhaps there's insurance coverage, and perhaps that's a regulatory framework separate from adult use cannabis. But for a state like Georgia, they have medical cannabis, which is now federally legal, and they have hemp, and their hemp program is unscheduled, cannabis right now. But come November, that will become either Schedule 1 marijuana or Schedule 3 marijuana. It could have, cannabis in two schedules, depending on what happens in June.
Yeah, thanks. We'll come back to that again. I have more questions about the status of medical cannabis under the new federal schedule, especially with respect to flower, but I'll table that for now. Riana, did you have any comments on the 21 to 25?
A brief one, but it also dovetails with a question we got in the chat. Illinois, I think, is known to be a very stable market, right? They've kept their prices and tax revenue stable, right? I mean, I haven't checked that out, but I've heard that. So I think from an operator's perspective, they're probably really liking Illinois, and that might be a better investment. So I'm going to root for Illinois to get bumped up next time.
Okay. Illinois, obviously huge potential there, no question. As with I put it in a similar category to New York, where there's just this huge potential that's being maybe frustrated at the moment, but kind of unlimited upside in the longer term. One thing that's going on in Illinois, where you have Missouri, which has been skyrocketing up by rankings and doing very well with recreational, and so you have a lot of this cross-border trade. It's like a lot of the areas in Illinois, just the prices there's such a price differential between Illinois and Missouri that you have all these consumers along the border areas that are just driving over to Missouri to buy weed there, and then you have other border areas in Illinois on the other side, they're doing the same. So if I were a long-term investor, I think I'm sympathetic to that. It's like a long-term bet. Can you sort of be patient and wait out a positive change? On the other hand, if I were an operator there right now, I'd be extremely frustrated with facing higher costs than almost anywhere else in the country.
Do you have any insight? How have they been able to sustain their prices? Because what I was talking about with somebody was that's just a natural progression. Prices are going to continue to go down. I mean, this is all information I'm parroting from you, and so you cannot count on these higher prices. You can't build it into your business model. And the person pointed out, well, Illinois, they've kept their prices up, and so we were both pondering, what have they done? I remember they had very limited licenses in the medical day. I know that and this is how it's related to the question in the chat. Somebody asked which states have had the most successful social equity programs. And I believe Illinois has been considered successful, but I don't think they have as limited licensing with adult use. So that's not the reason for their pricing, right? Do you know how have they kept prices stable? Should they expect them to stay stable? And can you and Shawn answer really quickly which social equity programs you think have been successful?
I'll take on the first half of that. I don't know much about Illinois social equity, but keeping prices high is not the choice of the retailers or of the producers there. It's a function of the costs that they face. So people aren't taking big margins or price gouging or taking big profits. They're just the costs that they face are just being reflected onto the consumer in the marketplace. And so the result of the high prices is not that the licensed Illinois cannabis businesses are making more money or quote unquote able to charge higher prices. They're charging the prices that they can bear based on their costs, and they're just losing a lot of business to the illegal market. So the price differential between legal and illegal, I mean, you see this playing out across the country in many states, but the higher the legal cost base is, the higher the prices they're forced to charge. It's not their choice. They're being forced to charge those prices, and the more business they're losing to illegal. Shawn, do you know anything about not to put you on the spot, but about the Illinois social equity situation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not the expert, but I know, a bit about the various programs. And I think if the question is which one is the best, I think all of them have room for improvement. Illinois, I think I would say, well resourced, with, kind of mixed results and a good lessons learned for ways to make these programs more functional. But I think they, still had kind of one of the core problems of some of the equity programs is, having ownership stakes that dilute equity and having local opt-outs that, really handicap the program. I don't think it was the transportation license category that, didn't end up really taking off. But I think there's sort of a gap in some of these programs, and even when they're well funded, on what the actual operations are versus kind of what's on paper. But I think Massachusetts may be a standout. I know they awarded a significant amount to maybe, I think it was almost 200 businesses last year. And I think they coupled the priority licensing with direct capital gains rather than just kind of preferences. So it's a bit more functional than other programs. And this Cannabis Control Commission has like a dedicated program with technical assistance and training, which I think goes a long way instead of just preferences, actually giving folks the resources. So I think, most of them are significantly flawed, but Massachusetts has at least gotten some money into the system and done some training, and it may be a good model to look at.
I'm so happy to hear that. Massachusetts being my home state, and I couldn't agree more that the biggest barrier in so many situations is not getting your license first, or even lower license fees or something. It's assistance with navigating the bureaucracy and the advantages, and leveling out these completely unfair advantages that the elites of our society have over the non-elites, in terms of everything from raising capital to dealing with all these state agencies and filling out paperwork and knowing how to run any kind of legal business. It's not easy.
I was curious, Robin, when you do your rankings, what trajectory do you look at the sales and the economics? Because if we're thinking about Illinois, it started adult use sales in 2023. Is that right? What time span do you look at?
I mean, I'm looking for the indefinite future in terms of the potential. And there's no specific window. I have Illinois down as legalizing in 2020 recreational, but there's always different ways of defining the opening of the market. Whether, what's the first store open. I try to define it as when the first retail store opens, first recreational retail and first medical retail store, which is sometimes hard to get a grasp on. So Illinois had a few years. It's not brand new in the recreational market. We're a bit behind here, so I'm going to move. Riana, go ahead to the next.
Social equity conversation by pointing whoever asked in the audience to the Minority Cannabis Business Association, specifically because they do these workshops that are tailored to the various states that they visit. And so Nevada could not compare and could not do what Massachusetts did, for example, but they did a workshop and they had recommendations for Nevada specifically. So I would point to that organization and multiple others, the Drug Policy Alliance and others, for more information on social equity.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Yeah, CBA, absolutely.
So from 16 to 20, I'm gonna move pretty quickly through this one. And New Jersey moved up a couple slots. Nothing big. There weren't any major regulatory developments or anything there, but New Jersey just been kind of cranking away and expanding the system. Showing up their counterparts from across the Hudson and showing that I think New Jersey's had less time and has done more with their recreational rollout than New York. And as a result, among other things, they're getting customers from across the river. But again, a state with huge potential and big population, big demand, consumer demand. There's a lot of weed smokers in New Jersey, and both on medical and recreational sides. And there's really good retail coverage there, and prices are reasonable compared to many other East Coast states. And that's mainly, I'd say, a result of competition. But there also haven't just been any huge cost barriers on the regulatory side. It's kind of modest by East Coast standards. The barriers are facing Texas, which didn't move up or down in the rankings, but they've been extremely volatile in the last few editions of this rankings. And so I want to talk. Texas is always a flashpoint this year and last year, the national cannabis industry, because it's by my estimation the second largest cannabis market in America, legal cannabis market, depending on how you define legal. I estimate its hemp retail sales at $4 billion a year, or that's as of a point in time a few months ago, before flower was basically taken off the table from hemp. There's now been an expansion, a so-called expansion of their medical system, which was, the medical system in Texas has been essentially non-functional, this extremely tiny sliver of the market for years, because among other things, they were not allowed to sell flower, medical. So hemp came in selling flower everywhere, which obviously was these licensed medical cannabis operators in Texas, which is just basically the duopoly covering the whole state, but they were not at all amused when they're not allowed to sell flower, and then all of a sudden 7,000 hemp stores around Texas start selling THCA flower and calling it hemp. The power of the people there has just been incredible to watch. I've been testifying there a couple of times in the state legislature, and seeing all these people coming from all over the states, just completely cutting across the political spectrum. You have Republicans and military veterans and old lefty hippies, like side by side, standing up against what they see as a huge government taking of an industry that had been developing for 5 years into one of the most vibrant legal cannabis markets in the country. At the same time, one that was desperately in need of regulation and had huge holes and problems, such as no age verification required by law, because they couldn't decide whether it should be outlawed completely. That's still absolutely in flux. Huge fight there going on as we speak. Still, at the moment, it's looking like, as things stand right now, hemp is allowed to keep beverages, and hemp is going to be allowed to keep beverages and some gummies, and not flower. I'm curious if either of you have thoughts on Texas, this month, and what's going on there, and what future we have to look forward to, possibly.
Being my home state, and living here now, yeah, it's been really interesting just being in it. I do agree. It's arguably the biggest cannabis market in the country, and you see a really broad consumer base, from consumers to medical patients to, adults and music venues. And in so many ways, it's more progressive than, social use in Colorado. And, there's specs and Total Wine, but also just, a lot of small businesses. But I think it's still unknown what's going to happen here. It's sort of the intersection of the hemp market, just having a growing presence and consumer base, but also the federal redefinition coming in November, and the rescheduling of cannabis coinciding with the meaningful expansion of the medical program. They issued 12 new licenses, so there will be 15 total. They expanded qualifying conditions so that, it really, in addition to other reforms, can now be a functional cannabis program. It still doesn't have flower, but we have pulmonary inhalation devices, vapes, and, enough products to serve the patient base. So it'll depend, I think, on how and whether the cut program rolls out, they've already done one rescore of the conditional licenses awarded. So that, it's possible the license process and implementation gets held up in litigation, or, there may be some legislative changes needed. Texas is sort of a microcosm of the federal government, as far as, having a staunch opponent in the Senate to hemp and cannabis. Federally, we have Mitch McConnell. In Texas, we have Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, who's, really never been a champion of the program. And, certainly wants to see the hemp market shut down. And, it would be, I think, pretty unusual for Texas to maintain a hemp program in violation of federal law, with the redefinition ahead. But it is, the biggest hemp market and for, many businesses, and there's a number of stakeholders here. So, you could see in the legislative session, like we will federally with the Van Dyne bill, beverage efforts, regulatory efforts, continued efforts by the governor to regulate low dose cannabis outside of the medical program. It'll be difficult, I think, to get anything outside of federal law done in the Senate. But if the Texas legislature meets every other year for about 6 months, so a limited kind of expedited time to get things done. So it's also possible the status quo remains. And as many of you know, the THCA flower is subject to a lawsuit, which has a lot of action. So it's a wild world where it's legal and then illegal the next day. And it's a Wild West out here. But it's I think getting the community and the industry meaningfully engaged for reform. And
theoretically legalizing vapes, but then, how long is that actually going to take to happen? I've heard people saying that might take 3 years. Is that?
Oh, no, there's already available products and at least one of the operators. Yeah, so it's coming online, and I know the licensees have been preparing for this and educating their doctors. So
okay, well, that's good to hear. I mean, for the 12 new licensees there, or however many it ends up being, it's hard for me to imagine being one of them. Oh, let's get into this medical market right at this moment of flux nationally, in the wake of hemp and in the context of everything else that's changing every day. It's these big barriers to entry, extremely high licensing fees, in exchange for being part of this protected oligopoly. And in some ways, it feels like a very antiquated way of thinking about the market, that it would be a good investment to get into medical marijuana in Texas right now, even in light of the expansion of the permissible product categories.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks, myself included, see the benefits of a medically focused business in Texas, despite what happens with adult use and hemp. It's got some of the best medical institutions in the country, MD Anderson, a number of universities here that are actually doing quite a bit of cannabis research, and the second biggest veteran population in the country, or biggest veteran, so many seniors. So there's a significant population that seems to be looking to access cannabis for medical use, and if rescheduling results in more FDA-approved drugs, or a medical path for botanical cannabis, where or something like the CMS program, where you can have physician-mediated care, for MS or whatever your condition is. I think there's market for that outside of the program, but it's been so time and cost prohibitive and intensive to get one of these licenses, and only last session did the program expand, that it's been a significant investment. But things only go in one direction in Texas with reform, but it's a big state to move.
That's a great answer to my question. That's a very interesting comment. I mean, I talk about antiquated model. I mean, the antiquated model is medical marijuana, quote unquote. Medical marijuana is really just recreational marijuana pretending to be medical. You're saying no. I mean, the future there is. We all know medical marijuana is a very important treatment modality that millions of people, especially in Texas, people like veterans and people with PTSD and all these different ailments that marijuana may have the unique ability to treat compared to any pharmaceutical product that's currently in the mainstream pharmaceutical market, and that Texas could become a hub for that because of its positioning in medicine generally. I think that's a very interesting point for Texas, and even more interesting in light of the federal changes right now. So that's cool. Let's go on to number 15 to 11. Here we have Kentucky, the biggest mover here. So Minnesota. I've talked in previous episodes a lot about Minnesota. I love to talk about Minnesota with their unique husbandry of THC beverages and the way that they've integrated THC, hemp, and cannabis kind of uniquely, these side by side, instead of being completely differently treated. They're two sides of the same coin and kind of taxed the same way. And Minnesota being very forward looking in the way that they've integrated THC beverages into the alcoholic beverage distribution system and enabled them to be sold at places like craft breweries and liquor stores, where they've taken a big share of the market compared to almost any other state, and helped compensate for a really tough time in the beverage industry with falling alcohol sales across the board. In spite of that, Minnesota is kind of stagnant in the rankings. Nothing much has changed there, and the rollout of the on the recreational side hasn't been particularly exciting. Tennessee, and Kentucky, two other big hemp states. Tennessee has just been extremely volatile in terms of regulatory changes. They started the whole THC hemp rebellion, and then they kind of codified it very early in state law, and then dialed it all the way back, and then but they're still very well positioned in terms of the cost basis, and they have well established hemp industry that's not going to go away anytime soon. So, but Kentucky, obviously, very interesting state. Again, huge agricultural community there, agricultural history, great farmland, lots of expertise, and you, you have two senators there who are on exactly the opposite sides of hemp situation, where you have Rand Paul and fighting the biggest proponent of keeping hemp alive as this alternative system for legalized cannabis, and McConnell on the other side of it, kind of ironically, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the benefits to his own state that have resulted from hemp. I think it's particularly ironic that McConnell, of all people, is the one fighting against it. And then you have North Carolina and Massachusetts not doing much. Massachusetts has extremely low prices that result from really stiff competition and lots of retail, lots of production, probably over investment, or maybe some people say oversaturation of the market there. But the result has been really strong economies of scale and efficiencies that prepare Massachusetts well to be a supplier, not just to their own state, but to other states in the Northeast when you finally have interstate commerce. Massachusetts is also a state that's strong in terms of medical and pharmaceutical. So I wonder if there's potential there with weed as medicine, coming from Schedule 3 and coming from that, as we discussed in Texas. I think there's a lot of synergy there. Potentially Massachusetts, it's unlike Texas. I think it's a state where the majority of the medical community is actually totally pro cannabis. Like Massachusetts is just a very pro cannabis state politically, and so it could be interesting if they ended up being a longer term leader in real legitimate medical marijuana, becoming part of, for example, getting on health insurance, which is the biggest barrier of all for them in terms of becoming legitimized in the medical world. Comments from Riana, Shawn, on any of those?
No, I think that's right on. North Carolina has been interesting, sort of like Tennessee, one of the states without, any adult use or medical cannabis, that has, kind of served consumers and patients with hemp, and, seeing what that turns into will be interesting. Do they legalize medical marijuana or adult use marijuana? Do they, continue on with a hemp program? So, I think those will be interesting ones to watch. I think Tennessee said they were not going to move forward with rescheduling in their State Controlled Substances Act, but they maintain their hemp program. So an interesting dynamic there. Their hemp program's pretty permissive, with pretty high milligram cap and on-premise sales, and it's quite a progressive cannabis framework. But other than that, yes, I mean, it was surprised to see Minnesota taken down a notch, because I'm not the numbers gal, but it seems like one of the most well-structured legal cannabis markets in the country right now, and that it's growing. But I know there's all the dynamics that come into play, but it's also been a good model in on-premise social use.
Yep, on premise. On premise is absolutely a model for the nation. Sometimes there's a movement up or down in rankings by one slot because other states move, and there's nothing particularly that happened in Minnesota that warrants it to be docked. But I will say recreational, as many predicted, recreational has just been slow to roll out, and that's it's set up in this side by side with hemp in I think a very favorable way.
They seem to have very thoughtful regulators and
Yes.
and I think maybe it's partly that the governor's office seems to be very involved in making sure that cannabis is a success and totally behind it. I think another thing that Minnesota really should be applauded for is the way they've entered compacts with the tribes there. They've It's really forward thinking compact negotiations. If you read them and compare them to compacts from 10 years ago from Washington and Nevada, they just go far beyond that. They really anticipate a lot of scenarios that may come up. But one of the most interesting things about it is to view it in the lens of like interstate commerce when that happens. This is nation to nation. And so them having to work out the kinks of different regulatory structures is kind of like a glimpse into what can happen with interstate commerce and maybe potentially even international trade. So I think Minnesota is pretty cool.
Yeah, agreed. Those are very good insights, and I think Minnesota. I predict Minnesota is going to move up soon. I think that there's some growing pains with the recreational rollout that they'll work out, but the tribal immigration is a very important point.
One thing can I say, because it's related to this whole, having like a real medical track, like in maybe potentially in
Yeah,
Texas and in Massachusetts, taking it seriously. It is just kind of a weird dichotomy to me that the federal government seems to have in the rescheduling order has this dedication to medical, but then what it's legalizing is not the way we really do medicine in the United States. It's the way we do this whole made up experiment. So it's just going to be interesting to see, okay, okay, you federal government and you acting attorney general are saying this has to be medical, but which aspects of the medical field are we really going to follow? Under the rescheduling order, it's just, a physician recommendation. That's pretty much the only actual medical, requirement, right? I'm curious what Shawn thinks about that.
I think that's right on it. I think, it challenges, the system that they created where you really defer to the state licensing system practically in many states does not have a lot of medical functions, is, kind of
yeah,
untenable long term. So I think this whole exercise kind of makes the case for descheduling, for some uses and, a regulatory framework more like alcohol or some of the hemp frameworks we've seen where certain products are sold in bars and restaurants where consumers use them and, where there's less onerous, you know, restrictions that have sort of crippled the industry and where we're, more reasonably regulated. But the scheduling process itself, when you move a substance from one schedule to another, they have to consider the federal government, 8 specific factors, and they're based on medical use and abuse potential, and it's the purpose is to control drugs for their medical use and to protect public health and safety. So what is the best regulatory framework for a substance like cannabis, where there's a sincere medical use and there's also an adult use as an intoxicant. And when the FDA made its scheduling recommendation, it historically compared cannabis to alcohol, which was unique. It usually compares it only to other or only to FDA approved drugs. But it noted its relative safety compared to alcohol. So I think rescheduling will be a bridge to descheduling, which is in a regulatory framework, which is the most appropriate for cannabis, and the only solution for criminal justice reform, among other things. But how will medical marijuana be regulated? In kind of this medical cannabis renaissance that's happening right now, we just saw the first breakthrough therapy designation for a cannabis-based full spectrum botanical out of Germany for I think it was chronic back pain. And I think, we'll start seeing whether it's drugs or dietary supplements, go through more traditional FDA pathways where there's research data that supports the safety and efficacy of specific products for certain conditions. And, those may have a separate regulatory framework, and how that's scheduled, whether the appropriate schedule is Schedule 3 is a question, because Schedule 3, it's like ketamine or prescription steroids. Is it, more stringent than benzodiazepines? Like, is that the appropriate schedule, or should it be more like an over-the-counter, higher potency products, may be different. So we may see, I think more on the medical drug development side.
That's super interesting. I think one oddity of the list in any schedule, but especially Schedule 3, you see it's some combination of drugs that are mostly used medically. Benzodiazepines, there's some recreational use of benzos, but not that much. You have Adderall, which is obviously has huge recreational use, and there's never any discussion of should Adderall be recreationally legalized for some reason. I don't know why. There's almost never any discussion of cocaine, which started as a pharmaceutical product and was for many years before there was any recreational first legalization, then illegalization many, many years ago. People love to forget that during Prohibition, for all of Prohibition, alcohol was medically legal. There was a legal medical alcohol system. You could get a prescription for your doctor for whiskey and walk into a drugstore and buy whiskey even at the height of Prohibition. And then when we came out of Prohibition, there wasn't a transition that went back through that expanded medical and then moved back to recreational. It was just like all or nothing. So each of these drugs kind of follow their own historical trajectory, moving politically from one category to another, and then you end up with these schedule categories that are just this jumble of things that have big recreational use, things that don't have much recreational use, and the federal definition being like no accepted medical use. Everyone knew with Schedule 1 that was the most absurd thing ever for cannabis, but there's a lot of gray area in terms of Schedule 5, Schedule 4. Total descheduling is obviously a different kind of statement. We'll come back to this again on.
Wait, Robin, I think you're going to move on, so I got to interrupt to share from the audience. Chris Murray shared that the biggest problem in Minnesota is a lack of supply for retail licenses currently. A lot of that is due to access to capital for cultivation and micro meso business licenses and local building permit issues. Oh, yeah. But I'm wondering if that's why they created that macro license recently, but I'm sure there's a lot more to that we don't know about. But I wanted to share that the audience, or that Chris shared that. And then there was a question from Tori Chamberlain. Earlier, there was talk about fees companies face and thus pass on to buyers. How is Schedule 3 impacting this for medical patients or companies? Let's see, fees they face and pass on to buyers. I'm going to assume we haven't seen those impacts yet. I mean, really, nothing about Schedule 3 has been implemented yet, other than the definition. Do you guys agree?
Yeah, I think that's right. States are, right now considering how they're going to, amend their laws to comply with Schedule 3 and, look to the future of potential interstate commerce and DEA, complying with new DEA regulations. So I think they're in the assessment phase for the most part.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, interstate commerce is the big question mark for me. I'll just jump the gun. I was going to come to this after the rankings, but since we're on the topic now, let's just. I wanted to ask you, Shawn. One of the things that's hardest for me to understand about rescheduling as it stands now is what does this do to interstate commerce? There's this question about an FDA drug being, an FDA-approved drug being legal to transport across state lines. I don't understand, even with this doctor's recommendation policy, I don't understand what this does to, flower in general and interstate commerce of flower in particular, but interstate commerce period between states that have licensed medical systems. Is that just completely up in the air and no one really knows, or is there, am I not up on the insider
I think
info there?
To be seen, how states potentially reform their laws and what happens with potential commerce clause litigation, and 3, whether there's any meaningful change in enforcement policy with respect to the FDA, because with DEA registrants, you can federally legally transfer from DEA registrant to DEA registrant, as long as it's
Right.
in compliance with state law and as long as it's in compliance with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which, as you note, most or all dispensary products are not. But
Right.
the past 20 years, the FDA has been hands off in enforcing its law with respect to state legal cannabis programs generally, and with respect to hemp, which THCA flower and hemp gummies are also not FDA approved. So I think
Right.
it's, very possible we see updated enforcement guidance from FDA, but it would certainly be a significant departure in priorities and, require resources for them to start enforcing interstate commerce. But also
Okay.
interstate commerce can't happen unless state laws allow it, and state cannabis laws are by design a closed loop system. So their laws would have to be updated to allow for interstate commerce and to do so in compliance with the DEA regulations and have, that would be a substantial change. So I know regulators are
Mm.
thinking about these things. Virginia is kind of the first state to start looking at changes in law, but
Mm.
that's going to take some time. But also I would note there's the Werbacher-Farr Amendment, which prohibits the DOJ from using funds to interfere with state compliant medical programs. So that could be a constraint on interstate commerce as well. But also now that we have federally controlled substance legal medical marijuana, any state laws prohibiting interstate commerce could face real constitutional challenges under the Dormant Commerce Clause, which is, a different legal ground now that we have federal legality.
Yeah.
So we could see those lawsuits coming. And there was an interesting, pretty relevant precedent in Ohio recently around their hemp law, where they said that their hemp bill violates the Dormant Commerce Clause, which basically says it's a constitutional principle that says states can't discriminate against or unduly burden interstate commerce. So it's a pretty forceful constitutional protection that could be the subject of a lot of cannabis action going forward.
I wonder, because it seems so clear that interstate commerce it was questionable whether or not these state bans were valid anyway because they did appear to violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. So it seems so clear that interstate commerce can go forward now. And so I wonder if the holdup is, well, it's just not that easy and there's not really the market demand for it. I have no idea.
I think most state laws by design prohibit it because they've had to comply with the Cole memo, and they all have these closed loop systems and expressly prohibit it. So I think we'll start seeing like our state's going to revisit that. Is that what businesses want? Are we ready? Could we see enforcement guidance that addresses it specifically? Vermont, I think it was a couple of days ago, had signed their legalization bill. And there was also a big reform bill that kind of sets up for interstate or regional cannabis markets. Some states like, California, Washington, and Oregon kind of have these trigger provisions for interstate commerce that are all being looked at now.
States are all in these interestingly different positions economically with whether they benefit or are harmed by, or who benefits or is harmed by interstate commerce. Like the New York, the last thing any New York cultivator wants is interstate commerce. That's the first thing every California grower wants, and the last thing New York growers want. Vermont is kind of the middle. Vermont, but all consumers want it. That much is clear. All medical patients want it. It brings down prices. It increases access. It converges national markets, and it turns cannabis into a more legitimate, real agribusiness and economy where ultimately consumers benefit from lower prices and more access. But in states that have been relying for years on these gated systems where they're especially on the growing and manufacturing side, where they're protected against competition from out of state, there could be a lot of interest groups that do not want to be part of one of these compacts. For example, it's no accident that the ones that are most interested in these compacts are like California, Oregon, Washington, states that are able to produce large amounts at low prices and are able to and want to export, already are exporting a ton, and want to just legitimize a lot of those illegal exports that are already happening.
Yeah, and Hemp's already had it, like so did they go the other way?
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move on to kind of six. Not so much moving here. Florida, along with Texas, the second biggest hemp market in the country, by my estimation. Florida, like North Carolina, is sort of like benefiting from the benefits of doing nothing for a while. For political gridlock. Going back and forth, arguing, but nothing really happens, and as a result, the industry is allowed to continue to flourish and grow and mature. The hemp industry, both in terms of flower, gummies, beverages, the whole thing. Obviously, November is looming large for Florida, North Carolina, and all these states that have sort of been riding on this in federal inaction for a while, and that could all be thrown into serious jeopardy. Washington and Arizona. Washington is obviously a huge cannabis producer with a big history, and they have a lot of advantages for exporting in an interstate market. Maybe this is kind of a low ranking from Washington. Arguably, they've been a leader for a long time. I think there's cost structure is the big issue there. There's just high costs, labor cost, regulation, taxes, business expenses. They just have high taxation and costs. And then the THC hemp. Washington has not taken a very permissive approach toward THC hemp, so they're not benefiting from much legal exports, although there's plenty of sort of gray exports as there are from across the West Coast. Arizona is doing fine. This is just Missouri moved up a couple slots, and Arizona and Washington took the slight hit. But this is really more 7, 8, 9 are really more about Missouri moving up. Missouri's just been doing very well with its sales and with the expansion of its recreational program, and I think they're benefiting from low costs, and regulators appear to be have the best interests of the state's cannabis operators and consumers in mind, and are helping fuel that growth. Michigan stays where it is, but it's the top ranked state east of the Mississippi because it has the lowest prices east of Mississippi and the most competition, and they've got the cost of production and thereby the cost of weed at retail and at every stage of the supply chain down to almost West Coast levels. You're seeing this national convergence with prices from fueled by Michigan on the East Coast, and so that's a very robust market and strong market. Will be a very strong market in interstate commerce world. It's well positioned, kind of transportation wise, as big, airports and infrastructure, and it's in the middle of the country, so they could serve a lot of other markets very well with their high quality, high volume, cheap weed. That's my spiel on 6 to 10. Comments from either of you there? I want to move on soon to Shawn's life story, so we're trying to move through the rest of this pretty quickly.
I don't know any thought. Yeah, I mean, it just kind of similar to Texas. I think Florida's such a big state and market with also a lot of senior citizens and sincere patients and consumers, and has had a medical and hemp market in parallel. So we'll have one that's be really interesting to watch. And yeah, Arizona is interesting too. It's a pretty mature state at this point, and it has a good number of dispensaries, right? I think I thought it would be kind of further along at this stage. Yeah, I would imagine it grows with rescheduling.
Just local prohibitions are a big issue there in terms of retail coverage, and at least that's my intuition. There's low prices, good regulations statewide at the state level that are very amenable to the growth of the industry, but there's a lot of like local communities that don't want it, and so there's a lot of areas. There's like deserts, retail deserts there, where they're served entirely by the illegal market.
I will yield my time to the top 5.
Drum roll, please. Top 5. Oklahoma. Any viewers who are hoping Oklahoma would be unseated at number 1, you're going to be sorely disappointed, because Oklahoma retains its top spot as it has since the first edition of these rankings. California stays at number 2. Colorado moves up 2 spots to number 3, switching places with Oregon, which slips to number 5. The main reason for that, I would say, is that Oregon has been. These are both 2 states. All 5 of these states, obviously Nevada included, are very good long-term bets. So moving up or down between 3 and 5, these are all states that have great potential and have been doing a great job overall with the understanding the future and helping a bright future come to pass in light of future changes in interstate commerce. Oregon has just been, I think, making mistakes with hemp. They've, as you've seen in some other states, Oregon has this huge hemp export market, and they're just basically, you have, for obvious reasons, you just have these entrenched interested, or Oregon is a state where was early to legalize recreationally, and so there's all these big businesses that have their licenses, and they don't want the competition from hemp for obvious reasons. Everyone's just gonna defend their own business interests and their self-interest, and so Oregon's sort of great. What started as, along with California and Washington, started as a huge illegal export market where the West Coast was just serving the rest of the country for illegal weed. It suddenly became this gray market where they just started calling it all hemp. So all these illegal producers just said, "Oh no, we're shipping legal hemp out of state. That's legal now." And then all of these, people had invested their life savings and millions of getting licenses and being law-abiding citizens and getting into the legal cannabis system, for better or worse, we're like, wait, hold on, that's completely unfair. And so they're fighting back, and the result is, I think, somewhat of a dial back in the permissiveness of hemp to be called hemp, and pushing it back into cannabis. You saw that earlier with what was going on in Illinois as well. Colorado obviously has been a leader since the very beginning, the first state to legalize recreationally. I just see, the closer we get, the reason I see Colorado moving up, and it's just in such a strong position, because the closer we get to federal legalization, with rescheduling, which is maybe one more step toward descheduling, it just, the more federal legalization becomes this more tangible thing that we see in the future, and the more we take steps toward that, the more Colorado benefits. They're not just, the intellectual and commercial hub in many ways of the whole American cannabis industry, along with California, but they're also an absolute leader in medical, and don't face quite as high costs as California, and maybe the regulatory and the bureaucratic obstacles are not quite as high as they are in California. And I think you have a slightly more united and supportive population there, although there's certainly plenty of opposition as anywhere. So Colorado's, bright future for all five of these top five. And so I'll turn it over to you two for final comments on the top 25 before we move on to the rest of our discussion.
No, I think that was well said. I mean, this is an interesting set of states because it's, largely the kind of mature marijuana states who have, kind of have low dose or very restrictive hemp programs. But yeah, Colorado, like Oregon, has a lot of export. It has a safe harbor, so you can make products in Colorado and sell them out of state. But it'll be interesting to see how these mature marijuana states, whether they change their hemp definition in November, because they've already had programs in violation of federal law. Does Colorado keep their 1.75 hemp program?
Interesting to me, states that would never fathom ignoring federal law on the hemp ban, but then have illegal cannabis. It's so it's so weird. We did have a question. Have there been any changes to interstate commerce laws for Nevada and the surrounding states? No, but this was actually a comment that I had to these the top five, which is, I would like to see, and I'm sure the industry is actively working on this, and I'm just not in those discussions. In Nevada, I think there can be a very well thought out bill that anticipates federal changes and has triggers for what the federal government does. So, for example, in Nevada, we have dual licenses now. We no longer have medical only licenses. And I think the industry can anticipate, well, if all we get is medical, then we need to have language that on how a medical only program works. And I think they can give flexibility to, for example, interim committees and or regulators to kind of be nimble with what the federal government does going forward. I think more than ever, that's what's needed in Nevada, at least. We can't, our legislative sessions only every other year, and I don't think our industry should just wait and see what happens and then deal with it in the 2029 legislative session. I hope they can think about ways to address various things that the federal government does over the next couple of years.
I was just going to say, I think that's right on the Vermont legislation I was talking about. I think it authorizes the governor to enter into compacts with other states for cross-border trade, and it has a provision in the prelude as far as its intent to prepare for federally legal interstate commerce. So I think we could see, more bills like that, and then, maybe we see a States Act 2.0 or, federal legislation that, deschedules as long as a state decides to do so.
The other big thing in Nevada that in terms of cross-border trade is one thing. Another thing is cross-border visitors. Nevada, as Riana and I love to talk about, Nevada is being held back in a big way by its barriers between gaming and cannabis, where you can't have cannabis retail on the strip, and most of the main tourist corridors in Las Vegas and in the state are the exclusive domain of illegal cannabis retail because of these legal restrictions. That may well change with changes in federal law, or it may not. It remains to be seen. I was just at the Cannabis Policy Institute, among the many great things, kinds of research it sponsors, sponsored a research project that I was involved with Riana and other colleagues on trying to understand this cannabis and gaming separation issues, the economic impacts of that. I was lucky enough to be at the Gaming and Risk-Taking Conference at UNLV in Las Vegas, partially run by UNLV last month, and very interesting issues being discussed there. Some people think, including members of the Gaming Control Board, think that this is never going to change, and other people think it's destined to change as soon as federal law changes. So it remains to be seen. Big tourist markets, California, obviously Colorado, Nevada, New York, the Florida. These states are particularly impacted by states with big tourist industries are particularly impacted by policies and laws that do or don't allow them to benefit retailers, in particular the retail segment, to benefit from huge numbers of people from all over the world coming to buy and consume cannabis, and to make that a part of their vacation and their visitor experience. One of the big barriers everywhere is there's nowhere visitors can smoke it. Tourists, you say, you can buy it, but by the way, you can't smoke it in any hotel and you can't smoke it on the street. You can only smoke it in a private home. Okay, thanks, New York. For a visitor from Italy, what are they supposed to do? If they want to follow the law, they can buy it, but they can't consume it anywhere.
No, that's one of the interesting dynamics when you look at kind of the hemp regulatory experiments versus cannabis. I anticipated we'd be, further along in social use in Colorado, and Oregon and other states than we are. But, in some of these hemp states, there's certainly a significant social use framework and a huge market for it, especially at the bars and restaurants and music venues.
It's a really important point. I mean, the cannabis consumption lounge concept. I love to make fun of this phrase because it's like, you don't call the Staples Center a alcohol consumption lounge. It's integrating cannabis as one of the THC beverages and other things as one of the things that you can consume in an entertainment venue. It's not a place that people go to sit on a couch and get high. It's a place. It's just one of the ways you can enjoy yourself in a entertainment experience that's driven by a great band or a great concert or a sporting event or any of the other ways for socials, comedy, anything. So that's the future. Someday we're going to be laughing about this era when people talk about consumption lounges, I predict. So I want to turn it over. So Shawn, I want to ask you first. I want to get a little bit about your history, how you got into this. But one question I think we've covered really a lot of the questions about what rescheduling does and Schedule 3. But I wanted to ask you. I'm not in the business of political predictions. I don't know if you are, but I'd love to know your take on what do you think's happening right now? What's going to happen by November? What do you actually see happening? In terms of, is this really going to go through? We all know the ramifications. Look, first, can you just for those viewers who might not even know the issue? It's the context is last November's bill that essentially put an end to this so-called loophole for THC hemp across the country. Can you just give us a very quick summary of what's proposed to be done and what might happen between now and November and what the odds are you think is going to happen?
Tough questions. Yeah, it's interesting. They're sort of rescheduling in two directions with cannabis going on, marijuana being rescheduled to 3 and hemp, which has been kind of unscheduled, where it meets 0.3% THC, will now be reclassified as marijuana if it's above 0.4 milligrams per container, which would effectively prohibit most commercial products on the market and also most full spectrum products, used by a lot of folks for health and wellness and, that are the products that are allowed in the Medicare pilot program, the CMS program. So, it's a significant change in law. It would wipe out, most of the hemp supply chain and commercial market. And it was kind of shoved into the federal spending bill. There are a number of legislative efforts to either delay or establish regulations for hemp products. And one is the regulatory bill filed by Representative Andy Bard of Kentucky that would regulate beverages like alcohol and would allow other products, giving FDA a couple of years to determine milligram limits, with some basic public safety guardrails. And then there's a bill by Representative Van Dyne out of Texas, which would regulate hemp beverages 5 milligrams like alcohol. We may, likely see some other efforts to prevent the 0.4 redefinition from going into place. The challenge is Senator Mitch McConnell is a, powerful champion of cannabis prohibition all around, and sees it as a public safety issue. And he's in the hospital right now, but assuming he gets out of the hospital, he will, be in the Senate until the end of the year. And that makes getting anything done by November very, very difficult. It's just a huge uphill climb for the Senate. However, the White House has put out multiple statements making clear that they intend to work with Congress on amending the definition because it goes too far, in their opinion, in prohibiting, at least full spectrum products and, low dose cannabis that has the safety and efficacy to be on the market. So we may see, some additional legislative vehicles and potential executive action to, try and have, some sort of carve out for certain hemp products. And then I think, after the midterms and after McConnell leaves, it'll be, a different landscape. But it's, kind of, especially with the convergence of rescheduling, really causing the hemp and cannabis industry to have to, really look at what the regulatory framework can look like. There's a number of efforts, including led by my friends at Strategy 64 for the one plant solution, which I think is very, very sensible, and regulating the molecule, regulating cannabinoid. And I think we'll know more as the summer progresses, and as we get closer to November. There'll be another appropriations process where we could see some language. There'll be another farm bill in September, but whether there will be hemp language in there and, is unknown. And, there's all sorts of issues and politics considered in the farm bill that may, make that a difficult exercise.
I also want to ask Shawn about her predictions for the June 29 hearing, but I want to ask real quick. Somebody pointed out, it never would have occurred to me, that this Medicaid reimbursement program can't go forward with the current, when that hemp bill passes, because that would prohibit any of the products that would be reimbursable under that program.
That's right. The CMS program only allows eligible hemp products, which are hemp products that are 3 milligrams and under, non-inhalable products, and they have to be federally and state legal hemp products. So the CMS guidance is very clear that the 0.4 redefinition would impact the program. There's a number of good stakeholders engaged to find solutions here because this program's just a landmark bridge into the healthcare system for cannabinoids, and now with Schedule 3. There's opportunities in the SSBCI to bring all cannabis in there, and it's an opportunity to, in a framework, to engage the medical community and start generating real-world evidence to supplement, the cannabis research we have. So there's organizations like the one I'm president of, National Compassionate Care Council, that are providing evidence-based data and CME education to try and inform evidence-based policy to make sure these CMS programs and other insurance pilots can exist. But, we'll see what kind of congressional and executive action is pursued to address the program's functionality. And that certainly is a reason you've seen action by the administration so far, saying, we understand this definition's an issue. We're working with Congress to fix it. So that's underway, but tricky. And the states play a role too, like, the Texas, Florida, California are states with the largest ACO populations. Accountable care organizations are the ones that can provide these products in the CMS programs. If those states don't allow hemp, which a lot of states are already moving towards 0.4, those ACOs, those patients can't participate in the program.
I wish we had another hour to talk about that, because this is like the real deal of what is eventually going to happen, and Shawn's actively working on it and knows everything about it.
I mean, it's great too, because I mean, I don't know everything. It's really healthcare law, and it's, we're bringing in healthcare counsel, healthcare experts, the healthcare community into cannabis in a meaningful way, and I think that's real progress. But we've got to, I think, prioritize research and see where we can work together as marijuana and hemp to provide evidence to support future frameworks for both medical and adult use. And I'm cautiously optimistic about the hearing in June. I think given just the robust record of medical use and relative abuse potential of cannabis, which the FDA recommendation has already concluded belongs in Schedule 3, I think it's just going to be very difficult to refute that. So, and I think this very tight, closed door kind of hearing can also be a way of just getting this done. But certainly the DEA, in a process that they've almost never played fairly in, especially or with respect to this issue. But the law and science are very strong here, and I think that will be difficult for opponents to overcome.
Washington's been ignoring the recommendations of healthcare professionals since at least the Nixon administration.
That's how it all started, yeah.
So we'll see if they want to reverse their record this time. Here's hoping. Before we go, Shawn, how did you first get into cannabis law, and how did you evolve into the position you are now? What was the progression?
Well, it's a good segue from my spiel on medical cannabis here. I come from a long generation of psychiatrists in Texas, and was always very passionate about mental health care reform. And my great grandfather was the first psychiatrist in Texas, and he had 4 kids that were psychiatrists. But back then, mental health wasn't, psychology, it wasn't taught in medical school. It wasn't a thing, and it's such a fundamental part of healthcare. So they were kind of part of bringing mental health and psychology into healthcare. And then I was pre-med at the University of Texas, wanting to pursue psychiatry or psychology, and really learning a lot about medical cannabis, and talking to my dad, who's also a psychiatrist, about it, and realizing I might not have the chops to be a doctor. I wasn't excited about cadavers and labs. I was really interested in kind of the justice around medicine, and making sure there was mental health parity in healthcare. And it's like, I want to be a medical cannabis doctor. And my dad encouraged me to maybe look at changing the law, and that it's starting to change in some states. And he had boxes and boxes of articles around the medical use of cannabis. And he was like, look, this has all been locked in the closet. There are good doctors that would use it if they could. The laws need to change, same with natural medicine. So I'm reading all these articles, and decided to stop my pre-med track and get into cannabis law and drug policy reform, which at the time was really Colorado and California. So I applied to law school there. It was like 2007, and was fortunate enough to get a scholarship at DU, where Brian Vicente was, like meeting patients in churches, and, during early day patient caregiver, like medical regulation through Sensible Colorado, and clerked for some attorneys, volunteered with Sensible, and, met Brian Christian and Josh and the folks at Vicente, and started working on with the campaign. And then 17 years went by or something. So that's how I started. Now I'm back in Texas.
Amazing. My parents are both psychologists by training as well, and my mom was in the mental health field for her whole career. My dad was a school psychologist. So coming from my kind of early days, like being whatever, an activist in high school or college or whatever, not really knowing much about cannabis, but just seeing it from a social justice perspective, was always like very intertwined with like being raised by people who were deeply involved with the mental health side, and seeing, for so many decades, mental health professionals and caregivers have seen the potential of this as medicine. And I love among your many interesting comments, seeing this kind of maybe coming full circle, maybe this idea that rescheduling gives us this opportunity as a country to sort of turn back to the early days of really seeing the value of cannabis as medicine, and exploring all the ways that can go in the world of modern medicine, to be reintegrated and taken seriously.
Yeah, and if you
I
look
really
at
love
other
that.
reforms like FDA expediting clinical trials and, just with this breakthrough therapy cannabis drug research coming over from Germany and, turning into real patient access. And one of the things we're doing in the National Compassionate Care Council is just building and deploying CME education and grand rounds and what is the impact of the cannabinoid system, gets taught meaningfully in medical schools, even if you just talk about pain doctors or palliative care. So I think a lot's possible with Schedule 3 and state and federal medical associations, and a lot of doctors really wouldn't engage in the issue until now. So I think there's power in kind of unlocking the medical community and research, which has been, by design stifled in the cannabis industry. But, we have a lot of research that we've done, but a lot that we can generate going forward too, which is part of what the CMS program does.
Well, thank you for all of the work you're doing there and all of the other important work you're doing to help this industry find its way and the way of the future, both on the medical and the recreational sides. I really appreciate you coming on as a guest. It was a really fun conversation. Learned a ton. And Riana, thank you for supporting this. All the work that the CPI is doing, this and the many other really cool and important research initiatives and dialogues that you're fostering. Appreciate you both.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.